welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention to listeners that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, you can stay up to date with new episodes by hitting the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, if you haven't done so already. And you can also find a full archive of previous episodes at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcasts. There's still a lot we don't know about the novel coronavirus and its impact on societies around the world. But if there's one thing we're certain of, COVID-19 has dramatically increased our reliance on digital technologies. Schools and workplaces have moved online, holding classes and meetings using virtual tools. Public health experts are using data portals and contact tracing apps to help contain the virus's spread. And in some cases, authoritarian governments are using the pandemic as an excuse to impose sweeping restrictions on their citizens that limit their scope for protest and other forms of criticism. Researchers at the watchdog group Freedom House say the implications of the pandemic for online privacy rights and digital freedoms are bleak. The organization released a new report last month as part of an annual series looking at online freedoms to document what it calls the pandemic's digital shadow. Joining me now is one of the report's co-authors, Adrian Shahbaz. He's the Director for Technology and Democracy at Freedom House. Adrian, welcome to Trendlines.
Thank you for having me.
Your team at Freedom House have been putting out this annual report for a while now, and if my understanding is correct, you've documented a decline in online freedom and privacy for 10 years. So before we talk about the pandemic, tell us a little bit about that trend and why online freedoms were deteriorating even before COVID-19 popped up.
Generally speaking, when it comes to digital technology, the usual narrative is that there was so much enthusiasm around these so-called liberation technologies to rally individuals around, common messages, to break through a government's control of traditional media, and then to take information from inside the country to the outside world and vice versa, to have access to all sorts of information that normally you wouldn't have access to. So essentially, realizing that they had lost a certain amount of control over the information space and also the ability to monitor what their citizens are doing online, governments around the world in both democratic and authoritarian countries started passing new laws that criminalized certain forms of online expression. Oftentimes they were taking laws like defamation laws or terrorism laws and then just amending them to apply to social media and to news websites. And then in other cases, they were buying all sorts of new surveillance equipment in order to conduct mass surveillance on the scale of what we found out, in 2013 with the National Security Agency in the United States, or on the other hand, to conduct more targeted surveillance of activists, journalists, human rights defenders. There's been a lot of great research done by Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto around the NSO group, which is an Israeli firm that was supplying very sophisticated spyware technology that allows for governments to hack into the phones of whoever the target may be. These are often marketed for countering terrorism, for example, but we've seen in countries like Mexico, the UAE, Egypt, you name it, that tools that are sold under the guise of combating terrorism are then repurposed to target political activists, journalists, and basically anybody who is an enemy of the state. And this trend has been happening now for 10 years, where there has been this open internet that has allowed for individuals in very authoritarian countries to have access to a new civic space. So in countries where you can't go out into the square to protest, to hold rallies, you in some cases forming a pro-democracy organization or a human rights organization is banned, or would make you the target of government repression. And what happened with the internet and social media in particular is the development of a new space for billions of users to freely express themselves, to form, civic organizations, to follow pages, and have access to all sorts of news and information that they would have never had access to were it not for the internet. And now what we've seen is throughout the years, governments develop a whole new slate of tactics for restricting rights online and gaining greater control over the information space and being able to monitor what citizens are doing online. What we've been able to track over the past 10 years is which countries are shutting down the internet altogether, which ones are blocking social media and messaging platforms, how many countries are passing new laws that criminalize certain forms of speech, and then also how many governments are buying up these new tools made by many US, European, Israeli, Indian, Chinese firms. It's a very unregulated market to then spy on their own citizens. And so right now, I think governments have a whole new toolbox for repressing their citizens online. And we're starting to see a greater willingness to use that. And in some cases, there has also been this societal pressure in order to respond to things like the rise of fake news or hate speech. And governments are seeing that as an opportunity to further crack down on rights like free expression and privacy.
So, this report is an assessment of 65 countries. Without wading too deep into picking apart the methodology, how did you decide to focus on that sample of countries?
So we've tried to find a diverse set. So we try to get countries that are from all of the different regions of the world. We try to get differences in regime type, in economic status, also just in certain countries that have very interesting ways of controlling the internet. And then, of course, we also want to include countries like Iceland and Estonia as serving as a positive model for how to regulate the information space and the internet in a way that still respects human rights. And I should mention that the 65 countries that we covered, that translates to roughly 87% of the world's internet population. And so this, this research project allows us to get a general sense of how the majority of users are experiencing the internet.
The worst offender, perhaps unsurprisingly, is China. Has it often been ranked this way in the past, or was this more a function this year of how it's ramped up repression in response to the pandemic?
Yeah, this is the sixth consecutive year that China is ranked last, and perhaps it's unsurprising given the fact that from the very beginning of the internet in China, the state took a very draconian role towards regulating how ISPs could be set up, who could have access to the internet, making sure that all users are registered with the government, and that individuals and companies that are providing news or other information have to be sort of screened by the government. And that's what makes China such a unique case study, because it's a country that has always been behind this great firewall of internet restrictions. Major US social media companies like Facebook and Google have been blocked for a long time. Many news websites are unavailable in the country, and so they've been able to build their own digital ecosystem of search providers, social media platforms that are very compliant with the country's overall regulations around censorship and surveillance. That contrasts with a country like Russia or Iran, which started off with a fairly open internet, and over the years, particularly after some very large-scale protests around like 2009, 2010, began to fear the internet or to see it as this, as Vladimir Putin put it, a CIA project to intervene in a country's internal affairs. And therefore, they have been very busy over the past decade in building both the legal framework, but also the technical infrastructure towards in moving towards the China model for regulating the internet.
What are some other countries that might be important to mention here that have also followed that very restrictive model, especially during the pandemic?
We're actually starting to see countries like Turkey, Brazil, Pakistan, and even India move in that direction of wanting to, for the state to have a greater say in regulating the digital sphere. One of the main tactics that we see are requirements on social media companies and other technology companies. This is called the data localization requirement, where a foreign company has to store data around local citizens on servers that are based in the country. And so, right now, Turkey, for example, has just passed a very restrictive social media law that is requiring US companies to store data on local servers and also to designate a local representative. And just recently, I think it was a whole slate of US companies had failed to comply. They've stated that they're not going to be complicit in Turkey's censorship apparatus. And so therefore, Turkey has started to fine them millions of dollars. And there is sort of a path of applying pressure against social media companies where at the end of that, they're going to be throttling traffic and essentially then blocking those services within Turkey. And it's all this idea that there should be greater borders around the internet, is what a lot of these countries are arguing, and that you can't have, let's say, like the sort of highly regulated, safe or free internet without constructing your own digital borders to then have these really strong rules and laws against transnational or US companies.
The logical endpoint of that would be cyber sovereignty, which you also examine in your report, where instead of a single open internet, governments essentially have free reign within national borders to control the kinds of websites people can see and online communications that they engage in. Are we seeing this idea mainly gaining steam in those countries you mentioned?
That's exactly right. There's been in this slow motion splintering of the internet, as they've called it, and I think that over time we're seeing that splintering accelerating into an all-out race for cyber sovereignty. I mentioned, the cases of Turkey, Brazil, Pakistan, and India. But we also have to look at what happened in the United States when there was the ban on popular Chinese-owned apps like TikTok and WeChat. We saw that the bans themselves, though they were, premised on a fairly legitimate concern around privacy or even cybersecurity, but the way that the ban was implemented subverted the democratic process. It was sort of based on emergency legislation. And it's been disappointing, I think, to see a lot of democracies opt for arbitrary and disproportionate policy moves rather than taking an approach of, let's say, okay, if we're really concerned about TikTok or WeChat, let's pass very strong privacy regulations or data protection laws that, raise the standards around how Chinese, but also US or French or Indian companies operate within the United States. And instead, we've seen many governments sort of turn their back on this idea of an open and free internet because so far there's been a failure to address a lot of the systemic problems that we've seen around, a very lax privacy, the rise of disinformation and hate speech. So what I think we need now are for rights-respecting governments to come together and to find solutions for these global problems, similar to what we do with, global trade or climate change or whatever it might be, to come together and say, let's find some solutions that we can all agree on that are rights-respecting, and therefore we don't end up breaking the global internet and sacrificing the ability of users everywhere to access sites and services and chat with people that are based all around the world. I mean, that's sort of the best part about the internet. And that's what we see right now coming into greater danger.
So instead of taking this kind of whack-a-mole approach that the US has taken with apps like TikTok and WeChat, you're saying there should be a more general standard policy applied to all apps and companies that operate online equally.
Exactly, and one positive example that we saw of this, it's not perfect, but when the European Union passed the General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR, which is essentially this very large directive that set new rules for how companies, but also any organization, any data processor, can treat data, and what are the rights that individuals have vis-a-vis their own data. When they passed that law, it was what was really unique about it was that it also created a single uh, digital space within the European Union. So all of the borders of the European Union's 27 member states fell. And now there's going to be so much more data sharing between, let's say, like, France and Greece, that wasn't possible before because every country had their own regulations when it came to data. Now a lot of that has been synchronized. What they're doing in addition to that is the EU diplomats are going to places like Japan, the United States, even, and they're signing deals for data transfers that says, okay, if you agree to protect our data in the same way that we protect European citizens' data, then we'll allow for these kind of the opening up of the wall between our two countries. And the European Union signed a very large deal with Japan where they standardized their own data protection rules. What we saw, though, on the other side is this year, the highest courts in the European Union invalidated Privacy Shield, which is a very important data sharing agreement between the US and the EU that allows for essentially a lot of the modern digital ecosystem to exist. European judges argued that because of the US's national security regulations, EU citizens can't rely on their data and their privacy being protected. And I think, many people would think that that's fair, except for the fact that when it then came down to regulating their own countries, the same court also ruled that France and Belgium and even Germany don't sufficiently protect their citizens' data because of the same types of national security measures. So we're sort of now picking up the pieces and thinking, how can we create a larger network of data sharing and sort of cooperation while still protecting users' data. And I think that right now we're sort of in this unique phase where we don't really know, because right now it's sort of like a you know it's sort of like a game of chicken, in that on the one hand you have the courts saying none of these laws are protect users' privacy, but the national security agencies aren't really budging. So what is going to happen? I think it's that's going to be the big question that happens over the next couple of months.
On one hand, during the pandemic, we've seen authoritarian leaning or illiberal governments weaponize public health restrictions or states of emergency to crack down on dissent. On the other hand, we also have relatively free and open democratic societies like South Korea and Taiwan, where authorities have used these powerful contact tracing tools aimed at learning more about the spread of COVID-19 and preventing more contagion that a lot of people say impinge on privacy rights. How concerned should we be about this?
These smartphone apps for contact tracing or quarantine compliance have been introduced in 54 countries, at least 54 countries. And they often have few or no protections against abuse. And you've mentioned some of the case studies like South Korea or Taiwan, where the authorities seem to be using these tools in a way that perhaps has successfully tackled the pandemic. However, it does go without saying that there have been numerous scandals in South Korea and in other countries around how much data is being shared, and how a lot of personally identifiable information ends up being revealed. You've had people who have been sort of their sexual orientation has been outed, what their usual, habits are, or there's so much information that we can glean from a lot of the information that has come out from these contact tracing apps, particularly when they're tracking things like geolocation data, when they're mandatory rather than opt in, and where they are sending information directly to government servers somewhere. I think that since then, there's been this debate among cybersecurity and privacy experts that actually these contact tracing apps are better when they're opt in, when they're open source, when they use things like Bluetooth rather than geolocation data, and when they store sensitive data directly on users' phones rather than in some centralized and hackable database. What we've seen is, unfortunately, many governments have not heeded that advice. But you do have some examples like the what Apple and Google have been working on, which is this notification exposure system, which follows those industry best practices. You also have this Swiss consortium, which has come out with a tool that's being used by now many countries around the world for contact tracing and quarantine compliance purposes. So I think that there's going to be sort of an evolution in how we think of these tools. And right now, in the majority of cases, they're used in a very problematic way, particularly in countries that don't have respect for rule of law, checks and balances, and oversight around how this information is collected.
I'm wondering if, given that this topic often has a fair bit of doom and gloom surrounding it, if there's anything you see in terms of changes in cyber policy or online behavior that have been prominent during the pandemic that you think are worth keeping after we've found a way to contain the virus?
It's a great question. When you mentioned from the outset that this this COVID-19 pandemic has really accelerated society's reliance on digital technologies, I think it's starting to make us collectively as a society understand how we want technology to play a role in our lives. Right now we really appreciate all of the ways that technology can keep us connected with our loved ones, can keep our education on track, whatever it might be. But on the same time, I think right now we are in this interesting moment where we're starting to demand greater rights and control and a say in how these technologies are governed. Um, I think that in some ways, it's only when there's a scandal around, around like the NSA revelations or around Cambridge Analytica or what might be, that people wake up and start to realize, oh, this isn't okay. Let's try to reimagine what sort of world we want to live in, and how we want digital technologies to be a part of that in a way that is more like user driven and community driven rather than companies and even governments having this top down approach where they are imposing certain technologies on how we live our lives.
Is there anything else that you think is worth mentioning here about what the kinds of lasting impacts that the pandemic will have on digital technology and the online space?
More generally, as so much of our lives have moved online, we've seen the expansion of things like algorithmic decision making, or even certain forms of like biometric surveillance. That's surveillance that uses things like fingerprints or iris scans or facial recognition in new fields like healthcare, policing, education, finance, and even immigration. What I'm worried about is that the rollout of these tools has been so quick, and we haven't really thought taken the time to reflect on what is the unintended risks that these technologies pose to things like privacy, transparency, or even just broader human rights. One of the examples of that was as it became in the UK, for example, when schools could no longer grade students' tests because all of the schools were closed. They started using an algorithm to grade student scores that then determined, their final grades and which universities they got accepted to. And there was so many problems around the algorithm that they used that it ended up sort of causing this whole scandal in the UK, and people were resigning. People were saying that they're gonna find a way to redo the tests. And for me, the takeaway is that oftentimes we're so reliant on this technology, and we're sort of oversold on what it can do. Uh, and we're promised that, don't worry about having a human review of these scores. Like, an algorithm can do it just as well. But that's not the case. Not only are these algorithms often trained on biased data that then perpetuates a lot of discriminatory practices, but sometimes even when it has the best data, the algorithm just doesn't do a great job. And that's where I think, as we're moving to a society where we're going to be more reliant on technology, more reliant on artificial intelligence and algorithms for general decision making, that we need to demand greater transparency around how these algorithms work, but also some form of accountability for the companies or the government agencies that are using these algorithms, to make sure that anyone who is sort of like an unintended consequence of this algorithm being 85% correct, and if it's used on 300 million people, that 15% is a quite large number. So what are the ways that we can ensure that the people who are negatively impacted by these algorithms have a way to address the government or a company and get what we call in the human rights community a form of redress, like either fix the situation, or can they be rewarded in some way to compensated in some way that for any sort of punishments that they got.
Adrian, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Adrian Shahbaz is the Director for Technology and Democracy at Freedom House. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow the team on Twitter if you like. WPR's handle is @WPReview. I'm at Elliot Waldman with 2 L's, 1 T, and Peter is at PETERDOERRIE. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.